Thank you. Welcome. Tonight, what I'd like to accomplish in this talk is to help people understand what Kundalini is and is not, and to get to a point of common understanding. I think it's important to define it as how most people might understand it in esoteric circles today. An article I found very helpful was Edward Gall's explanation in a Blavatsky lecture called Yoga of the Serpent Power. In that lecture he gave, he described Kundalini as a serpent fire which is coiled up in the base of the spine of the human spiritual body. And in our energetic bodies, we have 7 chakras or whirlpools of energy that are associated with the spine. And what he explains is in the course of occult training and development, this serpent fire is aroused, and the occult student can direct their energy up their spine with the help of a qualified teacher or guru, and is taught to guide the energy finally to the crown of the head. This is a diagram. This is a caduceus, as many of you might recognize it, and it shows the 2 snakes rising up the energy pathways, and the wing pattern is kind of representative of an awakened Kundalini, an awakened perception, and it goes all the way up to the crown chakra. What's often associated with Kundalini awakening is this idea of supersensory abilities like clairvoyance or clairaudience or both, which is why people have such an interest in it in sort of modern esoteric studies or modern occultism. They're interested in these super abilities. It's associated a lot with powers, extrasensory and human capability, and most people have an understanding that it's simply an energetic capability that we all have to awaken. And so that you'll really see in a lot of modern culture today, there's practices you can go and learn from teachers to awaken this Kundalini. And that's kind of modern understanding of it. But it's really, I don't know if you'd say it's more complicated or more simple, but there's a lot more to it, and a lot more, it's a lot deeper understanding of it to really appreciate the whole purpose and the whole interaction we all have with this energy, which whether you call it Kundalini or any other name. So in this diagram, they show the pathways that traditionally we understand Kundalini to move along. The left side is called the Ida, and it's associated with feminine energy, and it's symbolized by the moon. The right is Pingala, which is associated with male energy and is symbolized by the sun. And the middle is Shushumna, and that's symbolized by fire. As you can see in this diagram that I chose, it's kind of running a constant current. Like on the left side, it's only one straight line going up, and on the right side it's one straight line. But often you see the snakes intertwining around the body. And this is because, we could think of the Ida and the Pingala as like 2 pillars kind of running on different sides of the body, but energy is constantly being exchanged in between them. And so this energy exchange is kind of symbolized by the 2 snakes going back and forth around the chakras, which are wheels of energy themselves. This is where we have an understanding of, and what most people have an understanding of what Kundalini is. These 3 channels are what create the chakras in the first place. You have this constant stream. Think of, oftentimes with energy, it's easiest to think of it in terms of water. If you have these constant 3 streams of water, it's creating these whirlpools of energy, which are the chakras. So these rising streams of energy through the body create these vortexes of very significant different vibrational energy in the body, and that's where the chakras come from. Another good story in Theosophical understanding of Kundalini energy is through Charles Leadbeater. He's a well-known theosophist and has written a lot of books on different occult matters, and I would say he's influenced occult understanding of esoteric studies beyond Theosophical understanding in various ways, probably in ways that are really hard to understand just because of the the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of people pulling from his material. So whether you've read his books or not, if you have an understanding of the word Kundalini or etheric energy or anything like that, it did come from Charles Leadbeater. And he talks about, in his early studies, his approaching towards occultism, he awakened his Kundalini energy. And I think this is a really good description, and I'm going to read it because it's better than trying to paraphrase it. He actually tells the story so well. And this is from the book How Theosophy Came to Me, but it was reprinted, I think, in a number of places. So he says, "It should be understood that in those days I possessed no clairvoyant faculty, nor had I ever regarded myself as at all sensitive. I remember that I had a conviction that a man must be born with some psychic powers and with a sensitive body before he could do anything in the way of that kind of development. So that I had never thought of progress of that sort as possible for me in this incarnation, but had some hope that if I worked as well as I knew how in this life, I might be born next time with vehicles more suitable to that particular line of advancement. One day, however, when Master Kuthumi honored me with a visit, he asked me whether I had ever attempted a certain kind of meditation connected with the development of the mysterious power called Kundalini. I had, of course, heard of that power, but knew very little about it, and at any rate supposed it to be absolutely out of reach for Western people. However, he recommended me to make a few efforts along certain lines, which he pledged me not to divulge to anyone else except with his direct authorization, and told me that he would himself watch over those efforts to see that no danger should ensue. Naturally, I took the hint and worked away steadily, and I think I may say intensely, at that particular kind of meditation day after day. I must admit that it was very hard work and sometimes distinctly painful, but of course I persevered, and in due course began to achieve the results that I had been led to expect. Certain channels had to be opened and certain partitions broken down. I was told that 40 days was a fair estimate of the average time required if the effort was really energetic and persevering. I worked at it for 42 days. And seemed to myself to be on the brink of the final victory when the Master himself intervened and performed the final act of breaking through, which completed the process, and enabled me thereafter to use astral sight while still retaining full consciousness in the physical body, which is equivalent to saying that the astral consciousness and memory became continuous whether the physical body was awake or asleep. I was given to understand that my own effort would have enabled me to break through in 24 hours longer, but that the Master interfered because he wished to employ me at once in a certain piece of work. So it's important to approach this assuming that this is a personal account and a true account, hypothetically. And yet still there's a deeper understanding of Kundalini, because if we're going to understand Kundalini from this perspective, it's a very limited perspective, even though Charles Leadbeater is giving his personal account of what Kundalini is. So that brings us to the point of talking about Fohat. Madame Blavatsky talks about Fohat and Kundalini and says they are essentially one and the same thing. So this is what I really want to explain to people, because Leadbeater doesn't talk about it at all when he was explaining his Kundalini awakening. Fohat is constant. It's everywhere in the universe, and it's constantly flowing through us. The quote I have here from Blavatsky's intergroup teachings is, "Fohat, therefore, is spoken of as the synthetic motor power of all imprisoned life forces and the medium between the absolute and conditioned force." I want to take you through step by step, because this is really kind of condensed material. It's really complicated. And in my opinion, if you can understand Fohat, at least in what it applies to Kundalini, if you can understand the way that energy moves through the entire universe, then at the very least we should be able to break it down and look at the human body and kind of understand how energy moves through the human body. And then you'd have a much better idea of how Kundalini works, and more so why it's something that's relevant to everyone instead of just people like Charles Leadbeater, who is clairvoyant and supposedly teaching on occultism throughout the world. It's something worthwhile for everyone to learn about and understand on some level. So that sentence right there, talking about life forces and a medium between the absolute and conditioned force. A conditioned force would be Kundalini. That's a force within the human body. It's taking an energy that it's cosmically found everywhere and making it personal, and then it becomes a personal energy within our own body. You could say the same thing about, in physics, they talk about energy is constant, there's no energy lost in the universe. But when we look at fire, fire is a type of energy, but it's a conditioned type of energy. It will run itself out when it runs out of fuel, and so then return to the unconditioned, the absolute energy, which is energy prevalent and latent in the universe. So absolute and conditioned, in this case, you could say Fohat is this type of absolute energy. It kind of runs the spectrum of highest to lowest in the universe. It is ever constant. But Kundalini is a very conditioned kind of energy. It's Fohat running through the human body. So the next sentence is, it is a link just as Manas is the connecting link between the gross matter of the physical body and the divine monad which animates it. For lack of a better term, let's say the monad is another word for the human soul or the higher self, because that's a pretty accurate understanding. It's a little more intricate than that, but that kind of fits for what they're talking about in this. And Manas is the human mind. So they're talking about Fohat is what connects us to our very soul. Our soul is much bigger than our body, or it's on a different wavelength than our body, but it constantly stays connected to us. It constantly stays animating and consciously involved with our body. So just the same way that our monad, our soul, is constantly interact with our brain, our flesh and blood body. So from the Secret Doctrine, she says, Fohat is thus the dynamic energy of cosmic ideation. That's a really good word to kind of talk about everything we're talking about, cosmic ideation. Cosmic ideation and cosmic manifestation. A lot of people like to apply cosmic ideation to some sort of God, but Theosophical understanding has a more abstract view of God. Some people look at it that way. It's almost like fate would be a closer understanding of cosmic ideation, or maybe momentum or inertia. So the universe has this ideation, and Fohat is the actual engine which makes everything come to be. It would be accurate to say that if Fohat stopped, even for a second, everything would just disappear. So the next sentence is, thus from spirit or cosmic ideation comes our consciousness. Fohat in its various manifestations is the mysterious link between mind and matter, the animating principle electrifying every atom into life, which is exactly what we were just talking about. Fohat is this constant energy taking the ideas or the potential forms and making it into real forms. I once heard or I read about kind of how a clairvoyant can view how a fetus is formed in a mother gradually over time. For us, we look at these sonograms and we see that it kind of grows from this form of like a bean, and it gradually grows fingers and toes, and it gets a heartbeat. But for a clairvoyant seeing this, there's already this form or this map that's laid out in the womb. And the form of the child or the baby or the fetus follows that map. It's like a blueprint that physical reality is constantly trying to follow, and constantly is following by the laws of the universe. That's what they're talking about. They're talking about that there is this cosmic ideation that would be like the blueprint, and Fohat is what makes it happen on every level. A good story kind of explaining it is from the Hindu understanding of the creation of the universe. This picture on the screen is Vishnu. The story of the creation of the Hindu universe is that Vishnu self-created himself and saw nothing. And they describe it as waters or dark waters, as they often do in creation stories. And then he fell asleep. After he was asleep, a lotus flower grew from his belly button, and when it opened, there was Brahma. And Brahma is the creator of the universe, or at least that's the title that's given him. And Brahma looked around, and he didn't see Vishnu, he didn't see anything, he saw nothing. So he thought he was God of the universe. Eventually, Vishnu woke up and they kind of had this argument, you could say, over who is the real God, Vishnu or Brahma. As they were arguing, all of a sudden they became aware of a different presence among them, which was Shiva. Shiva is often personified by a lingam, which is a phallus, the male sex organ, but in this instance, it's easier to think of it as a pillar, this endless pillar that goes from heaven to earth. And Vishnu traveled downward to try to find the end of the pillar or the lingam. Brahma traveled upward to try and find the top of the lingam, and they traveled for hundreds of years, and neither of them could find whichever end there was. And the implication here, if you read between the lines, is that Fohat is constant. Because Shiva is often like a representation of Fohat as we understand it. He's a part of the Trimurti, and they kind of are given this idea of creator, preserver, destroyer. But in this instance, this idea of the lingam and having no beginning and no end, there's this very abstract existentialist conversation going on in the metaphor. Did Shiva show up after the cosmic ideation and the cosmic manifestation? Is it the bridge? Or was it there always and they just finally noticed it? So that's a story very good at describing this idea of Fohat. Fohat is described to be constant, but it really plays with the mind in terms of where does this cosmic ideation come from? And that's why it's easier to have a concept of God creating everything instead of just the universe having its own momentum and its own inertia, because that's very hard for the human mind to grasp. And here Shiva is personified as the fruition of Kundalini energy. This is a Shiva Shakti statue. As we talked about, the energy was both male and female. There's this metaphor of sexual union, the balance and union within ourselves of this male and female energy. Here's a more modern drawing. Sexual union, I think, for many people, we can misunderstand what they mean by that. Here they show Shiva and Shakti as kind of combining and becoming one person. Shiva is shown there with his trident, which also represents the three nadis, the Ida, Pingala, and the Shushumna, that awaken in the spine. So hopefully we have this understanding of Fohat and how it works, and we can stop in a minute if anyone has any questions on that. But I want to try and take this understanding that I've explained about Fohat and how it works and kind of come back to this idea of individual Kundalini, this type of awakening energy. And this is a very good quote, also from the intergroup teachings of the Blavatsky Lodge. It is, Fohat is a generic term and used in many senses. He, referring to Fohat, is the light, Daivi Prakriti, which is the Sanskrit word for this kind of energy, of all the three logoi, the personified symbols of the three spiritual stages of evolution. So I want to explain that sentence very quickly. The three logoi, you could think of them as stages of creation. We just looked at the Hindu understanding of creation, but another form that kind of goes hand in hand with that is if you were to compare the creation of the universe with speaking a word, the logos meaning literally word, there's this idea of what you're going to say, that would be the first logos. There's this kind of preparing to say the word, which is like a building of energies, a building of the ability and the energy to actually say the word. So it'd be metaphorically like as if we're breathing and like getting ready to say it. And then the third stage, the third logos, is actually saying the word. Fohat is considered to be all three of these stages. And it's not just at the beginning of the universe. It's easy with these kind of metaphors to think of it as like when the world or when the universe was created. But this is something that is constant. It is every second of every day and in every aspect of the universe. This is happening now. It's happening yesterday. It's happening tomorrow. It's happening at every moment. This energy is constantly expressing itself. And then they say Fohat is the aggregate of all spiritual creative ideations above and of all electrodynamic and creative forces below, in heaven and on earth. And that's just really trying to drive the point home, as above, so below. As cosmic ideation, Fohat expresses as cosmic manifestation. So it's a very simple idea, and you've kind of looked at it as a story. We've looked at it as explained by Blavatsky in the intergroup teachings. I'm really hoping you can walk away with this idea of kind of what Fohat does. And then when we look back to our own spiritual path, our own spiritual life with Kundalini, Kundalini is a personalized energy. It's a personalized form of Fohat. And it's something that is constant. In other words, Kundalini, and this is the point I was trying to make, and in response to Charles Leadbeater's account, Kundalini is not something that you awaken. It's always coursing, it's always running, it's always through each and every one of us. It would be more accurate to say that what we call Kundalini awakening is more of a widening or making our vessel bigger for the energy and taking on more energy. And this is something, as we'll discuss in a minute, that can come through spiritual practice or just innate kind of capability. The difference between awakening and premature awakening is based on the purity of life and mind. And this is the first time I've used that term, but there are sometimes occurrences of premature awakening, Kundalini awakening. It happens more and more nowadays for some reason, which is why I feel that this kind of lecture, this kind of information is important to understand, if not just to benefit our own spiritual path, to understand kind of this occurrence that is happening in spiritual life with other people. So virya is the means to Kundalini awakening. Virya is one of the paramitas. There's 6 paramitas in Buddhism. You could describe them as virtues or excellences. Paramita literally means crossing the ocean to meet the shore. It means we're kind of coming to a new, perfect understanding of something. So this paramita, virya, is described as the dauntless energy that fights its way to the supernal truth out of the mire of lies terrestrial. I'm going to repeat that again. Virya is the dauntless energy that fights its way to the supernal truth out of the mire of lies terrestrial. I think a very good story, I like stories, by the way. I think a very good story that kind of demonstrates this idea of virya, this kind of need for spiritual truth. It's well known in Zen Buddhism. There was a Zen Buddhist teacher, and a student approached him and said, "How do I find enlightenment?" And the Zen Buddhist teacher said, "Okay, I'll tell you." And he says, "Follow me." And then he goes into this river, which is about waist deep, and the student follows him, and then the Zen teacher grabs the head of the student and dunks his head underneath the water. And he waits till he's like gurgling and blubbing and trying to get loose. And right before the last second, he pulls his head up and he says, "When you need enlightenment as much as just now you felt you needed air, then you will begin to be on the path of understanding it." So that, I think, is a very good description of virya, which means that awakening Kundalini is not something that you want to do all at once. It's not a technique that you learn. It's a part of spiritual life. It is something that happens gradually in response to our own spiritual endeavors and our spiritual intentions. We move our arm, which is a miraculous sort of muscle, and I'm doing it by thinking it. I'm telekinetically moving my arm in a way. Like it's a mechanism that none of us understand. And same thing with this spiritual energy, this, as Gopi Krishna called it, and he wrote a lot of books on it, autobiographical, which have some good information in there, I think, but I wouldn't say he's the best resource. He described it as the energy of evolution. And I agree with that. So what brings about this spiritual evolution? It's a thought, it's a trigger, and we just do it. It's like moving your arm. If you have the intention and if you have the desire, if you have the virya, then it will happen gradually. So I want to talk about premature awakened Kundalini. And this is something that Jeffrey Hodson, who is a clairvoyant and an occultist in Theosophical tradition, talked about. It's also something that I've learned and read a lot about in modern medicine. And what's very fascinating is both of them agree entirely. Jeffrey Hodson witnessed this clairvoyantly and kind of observed people go into this state from pushing themselves too hard. Or as a teacher, I once used the word psychically ambitious. He witnessed them pushing too hard spiritually and really trying to go beyond their ability. And this doctor, his name is Lee Sanella, and he wrote the book, The Kundalini Experience, which I talk about in a minute. He worked in psych wards, and he observed that people who had Kundalini awakenings tend to have similar but often easily confusable symptoms to that of like bipolar disorder or that of like schizophrenia. But he noticed that there were some very specific differences, and he recorded it all in his book. And I really suggest it, and it's an enjoyable book, and it has a lot of personal experiences of people talking about their experiences. So to go through the premature awakened Kundalini, the symptoms are increased sexual urges, number one. Number two, emotional disturbances from forces and beings on the astral plane through solar plexus. Obviously, this is something Jeffrey Hodson would talk about, but they wouldn't talk about in the psych ward. Three, a sense of increased self-importance, which immoderate pride can develop, so basically an inflated ego. Enhancements of powers of will, and discovery of means of using will to influence others adversely. So they're beginning to tap into these psychic abilities without really knowing what they're doing. Whirling sensations in the brain with consequent distress and even of insanity. So they might be hearing voices or something like that. The difference is, for a person of faith, for a person who believes in these beings who are walking around that are invisible to most of us, the voices that a person who's awakened their Kundalini awakening are actually real, kind of. I mean, they're usually entities which in Theosophy we call elementaries that kind of feed on people. So physical sensations, and this is because of the electrical nature of the nervous system. They'll feel like pins and needles are all over their body constantly, especially when near electrical devices. Partially seen clairvoyant visions, so they kind of see energy moving, but they don't really know what it's all about, or they'll interpret it wrong. Eccentricities. Again, we were talking about ego inflation, and we were talking about paranoia. Also, if they have anger, latent anger, those will be kind of accentuated. Basically, the rule of thumb, I mean, you can go through all of these things, but the rule of thumb with Kundalini awakening is that the virtues will be accentuated, and so will the vices. And that's why we call it premature Kundalini awakening. It's not so much that they were destined to awaken it someday and, oh, you cheated, you did it a year early or something. It's that there's a lot of inner work with a teacher that these occult practices involve, and you really have to cleanse what's going on in your energetic body. And it's really just common sense kind of stuff, like psychological work, not getting angry, not getting addicted, to anything, just being a clean vessel, a clear vessel. And if this energy is awakened, then only the virtues will be accentuated, and the vices that do come up, you'll be more easily be able to handle. And the last one, they talk about being influenced by shells. Shells are like after a person dies and their soul moves on to wherever they're supposed to go, the energy left behind by their physical body kind of keeps walking around for a while. They have this instinct to preserve themselves, so they'll find energy. If these people who've awakened this psychic energy and are just pouring it out, these shells will kind of go to these people and kind of feed off the energy. It's like moths to a flame kind of thing. So what's important to understand with these people who awaken their energy prematurely is sometimes it's just latent ability. Sometimes we're just born with the ability to release this sudden energy. Some people are born with the ability to, move things with their mind. Some people are born kind of all their life saying, all my life when I fall asleep at night, I can travel around and I remember everything. They weren't trained occultly, but, and usually in these stories, if you hear enough of them, they grow up thinking that everyone else does the same thing. And then one day they open up and talk about it, and I've had people talk to me about it, in various points of my life, and they say, oh, when I fall asleep, I have these weird dreams as if I'm walking around my house and everything's exactly like it is and waking. I'm like, you're astrally projecting, that's what you're doing. And they're like, oh, is that what that is? And they don't know it. So some people have this ability to awaken this Kundalini energy. They're not expecting it, and they're not perfect people, so they end up going to the psych ward because it awakens all these issues and all these problems. And that's just how it happens. How does one awaken one's Kundalini? I gave this lecture about a year ago in a couple of places, and because of that, I was invited to give an interview with this guy for like a radio show. And I sat down, and the first question he asked is, what method would you prescribe to people who want to awaken their Kundalini energy? Like, how would you describe that they should awaken their energy? And I said, I wouldn't. Absolutely not. And I thought, this is the first question? How long is this interview? Like, what else is he going to ask me? And that didn't quite sit well. And we had this conversation for a long time, and I described a lot of the stuff that we've just talked about up here. And there's this very strong kind of spiritually ambitious atmosphere that permeates culture today. Everyone wants to see these things. They want to witness them for themselves. They want to have new experiences. And so there's this push to awaken whatever spiritual experiences you can, whether it's Kundalini or something else. The downside is that it's actually occurring more and more, and Lee Sanella in his book notices there's more of an occurrence, and he says he doesn't know why. It could be that there's more meditative and spiritual practices nowadays than there was 50 years ago. He attributes it to that. It could be just that, well, Kundalini is an energy, an evolutionary energy. It's what propels us as a race forward. And so you could say that's a collective energy. You know, we all share it. We're all kind of in the same boat. So as we move forward and we begin to evolve, if you believe in that sort of thing, there's going to be more energy available, and we're going to be more capable of accessing it, whether we're spiritual people or not. That's a possibility as well. But what he does notice is that there is a more frequent occurrence of this premature awakening of Kundalini energy. So much so that I've seen some of it. I wouldn't say a lot of it, but I've seen some of it myself. I teach some classes. Sometimes I teach meditation, and I teach energy healing like Reiki. And there are a lot of people who come in and they start describing what they've been experiencing and these impulses they've having, and it goes all in line with what Jeffrey Hodgson was describing as the 10 symptoms. And usually I tell them to stop meditating so much or do different types of meditation, or really just to slow down. Once here at the Theosophical Society, there was a person who came in who was really frazzled, and I'm not going to name names obviously, but she explained that she was meditating 6 hours a day and she was having all these experiences, and she even tried taking electrodes like from a normal outlet plug and putting them on her temples to awaken her pineal gland. This is what I'm talking about, spiritually ambitious. So it's both an obsession and it's just happening as an occurrence. And so understanding this kind of energy becomes more and more beneficial and more necessary. But Kundalini is a constant thing. It is something that we are all taking part of, and you can describe it by many different descriptions according to different traditions. Christians would call it Pentecostal fire or the Holy Spirit. Muslims would call it zikr, and Jews or Kabbalists would call it ruach or spiritual fire. I mean, anything within excess is unhealthy, but that's not to say that this isn't already a part of the spiritual life, even if we don't have a word for it. And choosing to take part in it, choosing to actively co-create your own universe and make the world a better place, a more beneficial place, is a good thing. And it's something that, if you're so spiritually inclined, it's going to happen organically. So in Lee Sanella's book, which again, I encourage you to read if you're interested in this sort of thing. He describes modern occurrences of premature Kundalini awakening, and he compares it with historical traditions, kind of trying to bridge the gap of understanding why this is happening. He explains that a lot of times when people go through a Kundalini awakening, they will have an alteration in thinking process. Sometimes this can occur as a form of deep depression or not necessarily good things, but sometimes people feel truly blessed on having it. Usually if they can kind of hold themselves together, they come out the other side looking at the world through new eyes and embracing that spiritual side of their nature, even if before the happening they weren't spiritual people at all. So you could consider it in some ways all trauma. Trauma kind of forces us to grow up a little bit faster, and some people are very resistant to that, and some people end up embracing it. To the point where even today there's such a thing as the Kundalini Research Foundation, trying to understand why these modern patients of the medical field are experiencing this, what we can do about it, and how we can help them. There's not a lot of understanding of it. This presentation that I've given you is based on a lot of the stuff that's actually written in the West. If you go to the Kundalini Research Foundation, they don't have a deep understanding of it. They have a lot of personal accounts and they're approaching it from a scientific perspective, but it's not like they have Hindu gurus working with them and explaining to them exactly what this energy is. So as I said, the most important thing, as with all things, or you could say all things spiritual, is to just try to be a good person and live according to your beliefs. Understanding this energy, how it penetrates the universe, how it correlates with the universe into the personal individual, all of us, not just key select individuals, is a good thing. But most people who've come to this state of understanding, people like Saint Teresa or Saint Francis or different Sufis or gurus, they came to it organically. In other words, they came to understand the energy and the way it works without necessarily having a word for it. And so, honestly, just being a good person and trying to live a spiritual life, if that's your thing, will lead you to having more influence and more benevolent benefit to those around you. And that's really all that matters, and that's all that we can really take away from understanding Kundalini. That's the best use of it, I would say. Thank you.
Hi, so I have two questions. First is, you were going to discuss the interpretation or the medical aspects, how the medical field would interpret it. You briefly, talked about the Kundalini Research Foundation, but I'm wondering what they say about that. And also, the second question I have is I'm likening, I don't know if you're familiar with Lynn McTaggart's work, The Field?
No.
Okay, so this is Fohat.
Right.
And it was done mathematically by Einstein and Max Planck and said, it's there, we know it's there. And she wrote a book called The Field, which is a meta-study of all the scientific experiments. And I understand what you're saying, but the book talks in the study, and it just makes it very palatable to the Western mind because of the experiments. But I'm interested to know what the medical people say about it.
Yeah, that's great. Really quick, what was the name of that book again?
It's called The Field.
The Field, okay.
And she's British, and it's a meta-study, and her name is Lynn McTaggart.
Wonderful. Yeah. The medical understanding, I didn't go into every little point of that because it overlapped so much with what Jeffrey Hodson was already saying. But basically, a lot of people, whether through physical kind of injury, some of them have actual spine injuries that kind of awaken the energy. Some of them awakened it through spiritual practice, whether it's through specific types of yoga or meditation. Or sometimes it would just happen just out of the blue.
But they don't say what they think it is.
They can, no, they can't, they have to approach it scientifically minded, but they do recognize that they do call it Kundalini. They do call it premature Kundalini awakening. And because it's from a scientific perspective, they don't define what it is, but so the method is then to take as many personal accounts as you can over and over and over and find the parallels. And that's a lot of what the book does. And there's a lot of interesting personal accounts. And sometimes people hear voices, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they go through stages of depression that last anywhere from a week to the rest of their lives. Sometimes people come out of the depression and really experience this kind of elation, and all the colors are brighter and everything is wonderful. Sometimes people have lingering, what we would call psychic abilities, but it's not like concrete. It's just they get more intuition and stuff like that. And that's another thing. All of us get stuff like that from time to time, and I think people who are really open to the spiritual life will acknowledge that they're having these experiences, and they become more in tune with their own personal intuition. But a lot of people might, they might see like a haze around of a person on a rainy day, and they say, oh, my eyes are playing tricks with me today, and then they discredit it. And so that kind of closes a doorway to your own intuition and your own spiritual path. Or they'll feel as if they're in the presence of something, whether you want to call it an angel or a relative, or they'll just feel good for a moment, and they'll have this memory kind of float into their head, and they'll say, that was odd, what a weird coincidence, and they'll kind of close that doorway. But when you open yourself to that spiritual path, these things happen more and more, and that is Kundalini energy, and that's something that we all can take part of. But so, and medically, you're asking what specifically happens. Doorways get open, and they're not able to close them necessarily. Their skins will be, they'll have as quote unquote thin skins, in the sense that they kind of feel everyone's emotions and they don't know how to shut the doorway. So stuff like that. But obviously through the medical field, they test and take personal accounts, and it's not like they're going to acknowledge the psychic aspects of it right away. But there is a lot of parallels with what I talked about in the list of.
So does he talk about when they're in the institution, what they do with them?
So the question was, do they talk about when they're in the institution, what they do with them? A lot of times they treat them like mental patients. And the research facility, that's not a medical facility. That's just a place where they collect information and they're helping the medical field. But a lot of the times they'll treat them with antipsychotics and stuff like that. Yep.
I have a question about the energy that pervades everything, linking mind and matter, I think, Fohad. If that pervades everything, then it pervades plants and animals. And what is the distinction for humans that we have this, what we call Kundalini, is how does it represent itself in other life forms?
In terms of looking at it in other life forms besides just human beings, I think it's very accurate to think of it as the evolutionary energy. So what most people kind of understand as Darwinism, what most people understand as these organisms diversifying and evolving and mutating, and in a very intelligent sort of way, seemingly, that's how it penetrates other life forms. Like ivy, for example, has this aspect, or any plant really, but it's easily observable in creeping ivy. Ivy will kind of space itself out from other ivy branches like equidistantly. So it knows the optimal place to grow leaves and develop photosynthesis, even though there's no reasonable explanation of why it can do that, why it can have that sense. So there's this kind of will to evolve, will to grow, will to become more, and to not just survive, but to benefit, that kind of manifests itself in other life forms. So the energy of the process, the movement of evolution, I think, is accurate. Anything you can apply to that would be how Kundalini is, how Fohat expresses as Kundalini in other life forms.
So with Kundalini and being aware of it, we have a more conscious interaction with it, a kind of taking responsibility for it flowing through us, so to speak.
I think it opens the doorway, and I think it allows us to grow spiritually. And from some perspectives, that's the entire purpose of life. So opening yourself up to that can be a beneficial thing. Although for some people, I know Pablo Sender often says, I don't know why anyone would want to live a spiritual life. It makes your life harder, not easier. And that's true too. There is that side of it. But it allows us to grow. And as we grow, we can benefit other people if we want to, and everything in the entire planet, if we want to.
What was the path that the Kundalini got opened? What would start it to open in a person so quickly?
Are you talking about in the modern medical studies or in actual like traditional?
Traditional.
That's a really good question. Yeah, I didn't talk about that, but Blavatsky talks about the idea that there's, in the physical brain, although not like kind of the energetic aspect of the physical brain, there's different chambers and different places where energy can collect, this higher spiritual energy. The pineal gland and the pituitary gland is a part of that whole system. And so when we open ourselves up to that energy, it gradually kind of trickles in. And so there's this, well, we can look at the diagram that's on the page right now. There's this gradual buildup in the upper part of our spiritual body. And in all of us, there's a latent energy at the base of our spine. So it's kind of like magnets. If you have enough energy, spiritual energy from our higher self built up into our brains, the lower energy is attracted to it, and eventually it shoots right up the three nadis that we talked about. And that's technically a Kundalini awakening, if you want to think of it in that way. But that's a process that's very gradual in most people who are on that path, and usually that's more of a like kind of a Hindu guru tradition. People who are intentionally trying to wake that up. It's not something that happens in the West, but that would be physiologically kind of how it happens. At least that's how Helena Blavatsky describes it.